Good afternoon, Dr. Palczewski. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate some of your time. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a professor of communication and media at the University of Northern Iowa and also affiliate faculty in women's and gender studies.
Awesome. And can you tell us how you came to study argumentation?
I think the way almost most argumentation scholars came to it, I was a member of the debate team in high school and in college. And so when I was in college at Northwestern, I studied with David Zarefsky and Chuck Kaufman and Goodnight. And so I come to study of argument because I practiced it so much as a debater.
That's awesome. And did you debate at Northwestern?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. And is that where you did your graduate work as well?
Yes. I did almost all of my graduate work there. I did a third at the University of Minnesota with Carlin Campbell.
Oh, okay.
And so, but yeah, both my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD are all from Northwestern.
Oh, you're kind of like Dr. Zarefsky a little bit.
I will take any comparison to Dr. Zarefsky that you would like to make. I consider it an honor.
Hey, I could see it. That's great. So you're Northwestern through and through as well.
With that Minnesota twist thrown in.
With a little Minnesota twist.
Yeah, I'm also deeply influenced by Carlin Campbell.
Yeah, well, I could see that in a lot of your work, right? Because she also does a lot of the feminist rhetoric stuff as well.
And she was a debater.
And she was a debater. See, I didn't know that. You know, right before. Did she do NDT? I guess you'd have to have done NDT debate. You know, it was interesting. We were talking beforehand and how a lot of people, not just in argumentation, but in the National Communication Association, have done speech and debate. It feels like a secret society almost in the
discipline. Yeah, or we come to the study and the theory of rhetoric and argumentation because of our experience practicing it as members of individual events teams, the speech teams, or as members of debate teams. And so the fit makes a lot of sense. And there's a ton of transferable skills. So the research skills you learn in speech and debate work well in academia. The presentational skills you learn work well. The ability to take notes and organize vast swaths of information. All of those things are transferable skills. So it's a pretty natural fit.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. So what do you think the study of argumentation offers society?
So let me do a little bit of a preface first, because
absolutely,
part of the question was, how did I come to study argumentation? And I gave a little bit of the genealogy with Goodnight and Zarefsky and Kaufman. Both Goodnight and Kaufman had worked with Don Parsons, so I'm also sort of within that line. Wow. But genealogies sort of tell about pasts. Yeah. And one of the things is that argumentation, debate, advocacy are skill sets and approaches that constantly evolve. So there's a lot of other folks who continue to influence me and grow how I study argument. Lisa Flores with their work on the United Farm Workers, Karma Chavez with her critique of citizenship as a framework for understanding deliberation and debate and rhetoric, Carly Woods with their work on the history of debate, Damon Pfister doing work on argument in the digital sphere, Casey Kelly, who also is an old debater. A lot of these people are. In fact, in sort of the study of affect, Dan Brower in their work on publics and counterpublics, and Rob Asen in their incredible work on local argumentation and school boards. So the sort of foundations of argument and controversy and the ability of argument to play a role that I learned from Goodnight, Kaufman, and Zarefsky and Parson really have had the edges smoothed, have had the sort of some of the naive hopefulness worn away because of studies of contemporary argument. So your question was, what does argumentation offer society? And I think it offers a habit, an ethic, and a mechanism. So let me work through each of those. Argumentation offers a habit of thinking and decision-making. When you have incomplete information, or when there is not a single, clear, absolutely right answer, how do you make a decision? Or as Zarefsky would talk about it, argumentation is about decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. And if you never understood what that was before, living in the age of COVID really illustrates that. There may not be any right answer, but in terms of should schools reopen in person, mask to mask, what sort of things should you engage in public, right? There's no absolutely right answer. There's no risk-free. There's low risk, more risk, greater risk. So how do you make decisions about whether or not to open a school? Well, you've got to figure out how to organize information. You've got to weigh reasons. And you also have to always remember the decision you make at any given moment may end up needing to be changed because conditions, evidence, and circumstances change as well. So argumentation is a habit of thinking and decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, and in a way, getting used to the fact that a decision you make, you might need to go back and re-examine, which sort of transitions to the idea of argumentation as an ethic for engagement and interaction. I grew up in a military family. Both my parents were officers. And so there wasn't always a lot of space for disagreement in my household. But in debate, on a debate team, disagreement was never treated as disrespect. And in fact, a willingness to disagree with someone was a mark of respect. It meant that you found their ideas challenging enough that they were worthy of engaging with. And that if people disagreed, right, you wouldn't just default to, well, it's just my opinion. Instead, you would spend the time to continue the conversation to figure out, okay, given what you believe in your reasons, given what I believe in my reasons, how do we figure out how each of us might need to change our position? And so for me, the sort of ethic of engagement and interaction is a willingness to disagree, but not be disagreeable, a commitment to give reasons, right? If I say, this I believe, I ought to be able to explain to you why that's what I believe. And it's an ethic of a willingness to change your opinion in the face of new evidence or new circumstances. So the third thing, we've got a habit of decision-making and thinking, an ethic of engagement and interaction. And the third thing is argumentation is a mechanism for creating change. So Goodnight and Olson have this amazing essay on controversy. And what it focuses, are y'all going to be reading that?
We might. I love it. It's one of my favorite essays. Yeah, the fur controversy.
Yep, it's awesome because one of the things that that essay does is it uses this concept of controversy to talk about when there's sort of an agreed upon belief, right? That there's some common sense understanding. Wearing fur is good. It's a mark of being upper class is the example they look at. How do you open up space for contestation and disagreement, right? How do you even begin getting people to rethink? Video froze. There we go.
Yeah.
How do you get them to rethink what they accept? How do you get them to open up space for there to be debate, deliberation, and advocacy? And so I think without argument, you lose possibilities for change, and we just accept what is without pushing for asking, well, why is it that way? What's, again, the reason?
Can we go a little deeper on that last one, what a controversy is? So let's talk about what exactly constitutes a controversy versus just a debate.
So let me also maybe start by answering your next question too, which is what is argument? Because it builds.
Yeah, and then we can go into it. Yeah.
So O'Keefe is the scholar who made a distinction between argument one, the thing, so a statement that is an argument. I like the way Toulmin talks about the component parts. So an argument is not just a statement. An argument is a claim supported by data that has a warrant that explains why the data supports the claim. So that's argument one, sort of argument the thing. Argument two is the process of reason giving. So you can engage in an argument with someone else. I state my claim, provide my data and warrants. You state your claim, provide data and warrants. We challenge each other's data. We challenge each other's warrants. That process of argumentation is what argument two refers to. Controversy, I think, gets at the way in which argument is far more than just a dyadic exchange between two people.
What do you mean by dyadic?
Dyadic, two people. So if you study interpersonal, right, a dyad is one person talking to another person.
Yeah.
And so you can have a dyadic argument where it's just two people engaged in disagreement and reason giving.
Yeah.
No, an argument too is not a verbal fight. It's not a verbal altercation, although argument often gets used to refer to that.
Yeah.
I want to keep that distinct. I think argument is not just two people yelling at each other. It is this exchange of reasons and rationales. So
exchange of argument ones.
Say that again?
An exchange of argument ones, you might say.
Absolutely. Perfect. Yep. So for me, I think controversy gets us thinking about how argument functions on a much broader political, social, or cultural scale. And so it's not happening in a single moment where two people exchange, but the argument over fur, to use the Olson and Goodnight example, happened with visual images, with PETA, or the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, coming up with both television ads as well as print ads. It included oral statements where people made cases against or for fur wearing. It included images that positioned fur as rich and as something only the elites could have. And it included debates about policies on, say, farming of animals in congressional spaces and legislative spaces, but it also included argument in social spaces about whether or not wearing fur was right. And so the controversy spanned what Nancy Fraser would talk about as strong publics and weak publics. And that doesn't mean they're more or less important. Strong publics are those that have the ability to implement their decisions into legal framework or into institutional rules and norms. Weak publics are those that opinion form. And so for me, controversy deals with the big issues that we're debating about interpersonally, within our groups, within local communities, within state legislatures, within national governance, and also even globally, because there are instances in which policy is set in a transnational, not just a national space. So controversy gets at the bigger arguments, and the thing that Goodnight and Olson talk about is that controversies push us to really question what counts as evidence, what counts as warrants, and who has standing to make a case in the argument. So controversy isn't just about figuring out a single issue, like is fur wearing good or bad, but it actually pushes us to think about how we argue what it is we argue about and what it is we accept as good data and good evidence and good warrants in any given argument.
I love that example. I think that's a really clear, concise explanation. So if we were to use another example, it might be if you and I were at a bus stop and you came up to me and I was sitting down and you said, "May I have your seat?" And argument one might be, you give me a reason because you want to sit down. We would gauge in an argument two if I start giving you another reason, say, "No, I'm lazy, I want this seat." But a controversy might start if I ask, "Who are you to ask me this question?"
I think controversy needs to go beyond just you and me, right?
Yeah.
Controversy ensues when people watch this exchange.
Yeah.
And it ends up creating a much broader conversation about accessibility, right?
Yes.
Who gets access, who has a privilege to a seat. I mean, to go back in history a little bit, there probably was a little bit of an argument when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat when a white person wanted it.
Yeah.
If it had been just contained to that moment, you might have had an argument too between Parks and the person who wanted her seat, or maybe even the bus driver. It may have been a triad and not just a dyad. The point at which that act, though, blossoms into and participates in broader conversations, debates, deliberations about segregation, about Jim Crow, about Black social standing and anti-Black racism, then you've got controversy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Now, I want to ask a follow-up question about this, because I know some of your work has looked at the other side of this too, that sometimes corporations sometimes hijack this idea too. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
So whenever you are thinking about controversy, the Goodnight and Olson essay sort of positions controversy as a really good thing. And most of the time, I agree. There's a couple of interesting examples I think that you're pointing to. One is that sometimes a false controversy or an artificial controversy can get stoked when really we've debated long enough and we've figured out what is most likely a valid or true claim. We've got the data, we've got the evidence. An example I would use would be and this is borrowing from the work of Leah Ceccarelli, who you all might also be reading.
Yep.
I think there's a false controversy over whether or not global warming is happening. It is, right? All the data indicates it is, but there are industries, in this case fossil fuel industries, who are trying to stoke the idea that there's still debate about this question of fact, is global warming happening, right? So there are ways in which the reading of data gets skewed, where data that really doesn't disprove anything gets used, right? That it stokes false controversy. And that's not always useful, right? What we ought to be spending time on is, if global warming is happening, what should we do about it? There's a debate to be had. So the question of fact, I think, is pretty settled. The question of policy, what do we do given global warming is happening? That there's a ton of debate about, right? About what are the costs and benefits of different approaches, what, the impact on what populations ought to count the most. And so there are ways in which there can be a hijacking or a misuse of controversy. There other example that some other folks and I've written about. So Jen Farrell, Eric Short, and John Fritsch talked about the controversy that erupted over some comments Ward Churchill made about 9/11. And in this case, it didn't happen the moment he said them. It happened months and months later. And the function of the controversy really wasn't to challenge our thinking about what happened on 9/11, but instead it was more about political positioning in relationship to Churchill, right? Ward Churchill, not Winston. And so part of it is controversy can also be unproductive, like any form of communication.
Just
right?
so the audience knows, Ward Churchill was a scholar at the University of Colorado at Boulder, right?
Ask that again, your video.
Sorry, just so the audience knows, who is Ward Churchill?
Yep, so a professor, was a professor that focused on Native American studies issues at one of the Colorado universities.
Right, yeah, just they might not be aware of who he was. He said something about like Little Ike. He
Right.
made some comment about the Bush administration, but he wasn't.
What happened in that case is the day after 9/11, he wrote an essay that talked about how this was the chickens coming home to roost, that the United States policy in the Middle East had created conditions where the violence that we had ostensibly visited on the Middle East was coming back to haunt us. And this actually echoes an argument that a CIA analyst made in a book called Blowback, right? So this wasn't a left field argument at all. Part of the essay, though, referred to the people in the Twin Towers as little Eichmanns. And that was what folks really responded negatively to. And right, their argument was the people in the towers had never killed anyone. Churchill's point, though, was Eichmann didn't either, right? Eichmann never throttled anyone. Eichmann never took someone to a gas chamber. But Eichmann was the architect of the concentration camp system and was the one that enabled and made it easy to commit the Judeocide, the Holocaust against the Jewish peoples in Germany. And so it was the comparison of people in the tower and whether or not the comparison made sense, but it all just sort of blew up into Hitler called the people in the Twin Towers Nazis, which is not what he had done. But that's also the question about what did his essay mean. The controversy really wasn't about the validity of his essay. It was more about should he speak at another university. And like I said, nothing got said about the essay until months and months and months and months later, and then controversy erupted. And so the question was sort of, well, to whose benefit was creating the controversy at that particular moment?
Yeah, that's really helpful as a way of starting to illuminate this notion of controversy. So how do you identify when an argument has occurred?
Again, you can break this down. So whenever someone takes a position and gives a reason, an argument one has occurred. Whenever there's clash or disagreement, you've got an argument two happening. It doesn't always have to be at the same time or the same place, right? So someone can write an editorial to a newspaper and someone else writes back and answers it. You've got clash, you've got refutation, then you've got an argument two. And in both of those, for me, there's got to be reason giving.
Yeah.
If there's just screaming and yelling, it's a verbal altercation. It's not an argument. Reason giving's important to those. And then with controversies, you identify that those are happening when at many different times, on many different platforms, and many different people are participating in this much broader debate about policy, about culture, about belief, about practice.
Excellent. And how do you analyze it? Like, what is your methodology about going? So you've noticed it.
Yeah. So I think there's even a prior question to that about methodology.
Yeah.
And that is, why study something as an argument instead of something else, right? And I think y'all are going to be reading an essay I wrote about suffrage postcards.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I got when I was writing that essay is, why are you bothering to look at that as an argument? Why aren't you just analyzing it as an ideograph? Or why aren't you just analyzing it as affect? Or why aren't you analyzing it as icon, right? And part of my answer was, there's something going on here that you won't see unless you think about it as an argument. And so one of the points of this essay is, there's a ton of verbal argument about women's suffrage. Most of that verbal argument focuses on the effect of the vote on women. Hardly ever does anybody mention verbally the effect of the vote on men. But all over the visual imagery and postcards, there's images of how men are affected by the vote. And so if you think about the postcards as participating in an argument about whether or not women's suffrage is good or bad, you start thinking about, what are the arguments for? What are the arguments against, right? That dialectic, for and against. And if you start sort of thinking about, okay, what are all the reasons given? Women's suffrage is bad for women. It will expose them to the abuse of politics. They'll carry away mud and dirt on them. They're not physically suited, right? You start noticing all the arguments are about the effect of women. If you want to get at the argument about the effect of the vote on men, you have to admit visuals can argue, because that's where that argument gets played out. So for me, the sort of method question, thinking about interactions, rhetorical interactions as an argument is itself a method, because it gets you thinking not just about what does a single statement do, but what do all these statements that are bumping up against each other, controversy, right? What do they all do to each other and how we understand ourselves and our role in the world? So first question is, why study something as an argument at all? And with any method, what method does is it gets you asking some questions instead of others, right? Method is about the collection, organization, analysis, and presentation of data. Whether you're doing social scientific, humanistic, or creative, you're collecting data, you're organizing data, you're analyzing data, and then you're presenting your findings. What happens with the collection part, if you study something as an argument, you make sure you collect as many different perspectives as you can find. And when you organize your data, you organize it into sides of a debate. And sometimes there's more than two, right? And then when you analyze, part of what you're really interested in is not just what does one thing say and another thing say, but what's that point of disagreement, right? Where is that moment of disagreement? So for me, the method is focusing on the clash or the dialectic, the engagement. And then what's also interesting to me is how argument evolves across time, right? How did an argument shift or not shift? So the women's suffrage controversy lasted for decades and decades. It was interesting to look at how some arguments became more prevalent or became less prevalent as time went on, right? So this is also an old learning trick from being a debater. We would take notes, and for each speech, there'd be a column. And as you took notes, you could see how the debate evolved, how disagreement on some issues just stopped. It got resolved. But how disagreement on other issues really grew. And so that's where you knew you needed to focus time. And so part of the method is thinking not just what is an argument in a given moment, but how does an argument evolve across time? And then for controversy, asking questions about how do these particular arguments open or close the process for productive debate and productive deliberation. So that's when you're looking, for me, I study mostly the big controversies, the big argument twos. In the back of my mind, though, is always Toulmin in argument one. First step is, what's the claim, right? What's the bottom line argument? What's the data? Why does that data support the claim? And then from there, you get into the more complex stuff.
No, that totally makes sense. So did you notice anything sort of hashing out as you underwent the evolution of the suffragette arguments?
Yeah. So what is interesting to me is in the earlier years, so 1850s, 60s, 70s, there is much greater attention to arguments from religion about women and men's God-given roles. Those don't disappear. They stay all the way to the end. That's absolutely true. And what happens in the evolution of the arguments generally is that more arguments start getting added. Mm-hmm. And so as visuals in the postcard industry geared up at the end of the century, that's when you started seeing a lot more attention to the effect of the vote on men. The other evolution, and here I have to do the shout out to Eileen Kradider and their germinal work on the women's suffrage movement. They argue that within the movement for the advocates, they started with arguments from expedience, that giving women the right to vote would lead to different results from voting, and that would be good for society. Then they shifted to arguments from justice, which is, as citizens, as members of the nation, women deserve the right to vote. Let's be clear, throughout all of this, they're talking about white women. Women's suffrage advocates were absolutely talking about white, educated women. The fight for women's vote continued long after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the other thing I would say is, did the argument over women's suffrage end 100 years ago with the ratification of the 19th Amendment? No, because African-American women were kept from the polls, Asian women were kept from the polls, Native American women were kept from the polls. So we're talking, it's not until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act that you actually have full enfranchisement of African-American women. It's not until, I think it's the McCarran-Walter Act, that you have full enfranchisement of Asian Americans. It's not until the 60s, when you've got some Supreme Court cases, that you have full enfranchisement of Native Americans. So that's the other thing I would say, is think about when an argument ends, and it doesn't always end when you think it does.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question that you're saying right there, right? Or that you're pointing out where it begins and ends is a very political question, right? Because we often are taught historically that the women's suffrage movement ends with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which is in itself a very political
Yep.
ending, a very white history.
Well, there's an amazing book by Lisa Tatro. I think I've got the name right, called The Myth of Seneca Falls. So one of the stories probably a lot of y'all have been hearing is the women's suffrage movement began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. I'd actually start women's suffrage in the US in the 1500s with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, where women voted in council meetings. And later suffragists in the New York area knew Native women in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy voted, and that influenced their own thinking about women's role in society. And so I think the roots for women's political participation in the United States begins with the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. The way 1848 gets picked is because Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were really good arguers. And in the wake of the Civil War, when there was a split between those who thought white women should be enfranchised before Black men and those who thought Black men should be enfranchised before anything else happens, the women's suffrage movement split. And Stanton and Anthony actually really fell to the wayside. In order to position themselves as the leaders, they started talking about how the Seneca Falls Convention was where women's suffrage started because Stanton was there. And a lot of people think Anthony was, she wasn't. And so Seneca Falls, even though it was in 1848, doesn't really start getting talked about until the 1860s and 70s as the beginning. And it was an absolutely orchestrated PR campaign. And Tatro demonstrates that brilliantly in this book. And it's not that Seneca Falls was unimportant, right? It's just that it's a very particular way to start the history. And you can start the history in a lot of other places. And also the ratification of the 19th is a particular way to end the history. But if you really want to give a history of women's vote, you start in the 1500s and you don't end till now. Because let's face it, we are still engaging in struggles over voting rights and voter suppression.
I mean, today, right now, can you mail in your ballot is a pretty important question, right? But I think that's so fascinating to think about, especially when you consider the discourses against Indigenous people that were often used in Manifest Destiny about civilizing and so on and so forth. And yeah, no, that's super interesting. Yeah. And dang, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I always thought it was Seneca Falls.
And I did too for a long time, because the other thing, there's this multi-volume set called The History of Women's Suffrage, which almost all scholars use. It was edited by Stanton and Anthony. And so it tells the story. And so it takes labor to learn the story of Maria Miller Stewart. So the first American-born woman to speak to a mixed-sex audience was an African-American woman advocating for women's social role. The argument about women being able to be pastors, to be preachers, didn't first start in Seneca Falls. It started with a group of African-American women who petitioned for it at one of the annual meetings of their religious organization, right? That there are lots of stories to be told, but some of them get elevated. And this is where controversy comes in, right?
Yeah.
That there's a simple single story that's really white that you can tell about women's suffrage, but how do you reopen that story? And part of it is to make clear that the controversy over women's suffrage was never one just about sex. It was also always already about race.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
white women were willing to jettison the rights of women of color in order to preserve their own.
Yeah, so when you look at these sort of controversies, how do you evaluate the quality of the arguments?
So I think there's two sort of ways that you can evaluate. So one of them is, who's winning, right? Who's got the better argument? Who's doing better reason giving?
Yeah.
And that's more sort of focusing on the argument one. Another way that I think you can analyze it, though, is who benefits from a particular outcome of the argument. What is the argument doing to reshape our understanding of ourselves? So depending on what it is you're trying to figure out, what's a good argument, who ought to be winning, you use different techniques where informal logic, pragmadialectics, Toulmin, all that sort of stuff comes in handy. One thing we know now, though, is rationality and good reason alone is not enough to persuade someone. Argument always involves emotion or affect, if you're taking courses on that, and power. And so to study argument, you can't just look at pure reason as though it's falling from the skies. Argument always also has to get us thinking about questions of power, questions of position, and emotion. Whose arguments get read as emotional and whose arguments don't. So in analyzing controversy, for me, it's both. What argument makes sense? What argument is rising to the top at any given moment? But it's also a question for me about what does this particular argument tell us about how people thought, who we are, how we understand our position in a particular social order, and given that, what policy ought to be adopted.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I know we've talked about a lot of examples today in this discussion, and I'm sorry if you hear my pup in the background right now.
No, dogs are always welcome.
Yeah, his name is Ralph. He's adorable. He's 4 months old, and he's chatty.
Hi, Ralph. I'll see if I can get Fred Henry to make an appearance.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Can you give a contemporary example that illustrates your perspective on argumentation?
Hi, Ralph. So there's a couple. So I want to do this again, this sort of argument one and argument two example. So the argument one example that I would use is the sort of question of fact, how many people died as a result of Hurricane Maria? Right? It seems like it'd be really easy to figure out how many people died, but actually there was controversy and debate that emerged over that, with the president indicating that it was only a handful of people who died, while epidemiologists and medical specialists were saying that the death toll was in the thousands and thousands. And this, how can there be such difference about a question of fact, how many people died? And part of it is the warrant. So what counts as a hurricane-related death? And for the president, it was in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, how many people were killed because of flying debris? And that was a handful. But the devastation to the infrastructure and the fact that it was hard to find some of the people who had been killed meant the death toll kept rising. And if you go into the folks who do death counts for a living, epidemiologists, statisticians, what they talk about is a method of figuring out death by comparing how many people have died at this particular moment compared to how many people had died a year ago under what were normal conditions.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, part of the problem was that you had people in funeral homes not reporting deaths. And when they actually went back and did that population comparison, they discovered the death toll from hurricane was immense. New data, different methodology, different warrants, but that's the exact same methodology that was used to figure out hurricane deaths when they happen in Florida or in Texas or on the East Coast. And so what was happening is when Maria hit Puerto Rico, the death toll was woefully undercounted. And so you had masses, and the impact was undercounted. So you had much more resource going to Texas and Houston because of a hurricane they had recently had than you had going to Puerto Rico. So you can have an argument as simple over how many people are dying. And I think you see this some with going on with COVID. How many people have died as a result of COVID? And there's some folks who say, you have to have had nothing else wrong with you, and COVID has to be the thing that killed you, no pre-existing conditions. And others are saying, no, let's think about in a non-COVID, relatively normal world, how many people would have died during this time period. And so part of the reason I think you see debates over how bad is COVID falls back to a question about what's the data that's getting used and what's the warrant to support that data.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it raises the question of the counterfactual.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is, it makes me think of the debate world immediately, right?
Yeah. So for the bigger question, so that was sort of how do you sort of work through an argument one, a question of fact. How do you know how many people have died? For the bigger one about controversy, there's a ton of examples where we don't even know what data or authority to rely on, right? And are you all reading Goodnight's Spheres of Argument essay on public?
We actually are not reading, but we will be talking to Dr. Asen, and he will be giving an extensive conversation on the public sphere and talking about private spheres.
So, quick mini lecture.
Yeah.
Goodnight has an essay on spheres of argument. Part of his position is that there are three distinct spheres of argument: personal, technical, and public. And there are different rules, in a way, for the arguments that happen in them. For technical argument, it's highly rule-bound. Very particular people are accepted as authorities. Very particular evidence is admitted. There's a rigorous process of peer review. So if you all have ever read any scholarly journal articles, right, you'll notice that scholars cite particular scholars because they're recognized as authority. And there's a format to the way you make a scholarly argument. Law is another place. Only some evidence is admissible in courts of law. Other evidence is not. So highly rule-bound, highly specific, very specific authorities. Personal sphere argument, not time-bound. You may run into someone at a bar, talk about something. The evidence that's admissible is there's not, big standards. If you're just having a personal argument, someone can say, well, given how I was raised, that's what I think, right? It's much more flexible. It's much more fluid. There aren't set authorities. There's not set evidence. Public sphere is a little bit in the middle, where there's some rules to argument. There's some grounds that your own personal position isn't enough to warrant a public policy. And so you've got a different set of authorities and a different set of grounds on which you argue. I go into that because, for me, some of the most interesting controversies are the ones where those three, I wish I've got a drawing of this, but it'd take too much time to pull it up, where the three spheres intersect, right? So if you've got public sphere, personal sphere, and technical sphere down here, actually they all overlap. There are some things that are both personal and public. There are some things that are technical and personal, right? Medical treatment. Doctors will give you very technical advice, but ultimately you make personal decisions for your family. There are some things where technical, personal, and public all overlap. And in that middle, right, if they're overlapping, it means we don't yet know for certain what authority, who is an authority on the subject. We don't know what evidence is the most important. We may not even know the norms for how to engage an argument. It's all up in the air. So examples of that, I think you could argue, include controversy over reproductive freedom, reproductive rights, and abortion. The question about when, with whom, under what conditions, and whether to bring a child into the world involve personal argument, technical medical argument, and public argument. And part of the reason some controversies feel irresolvable is because we haven't quite figured out the authorities, the grounds, and the evidence that we're willing to agree on. And so I think that's one of the big contemporary controversies. How do you debate about something when you don't know the rules for the debate, or someone else is using different rules?
Well, and I think about the definition of life. All three of those spheres have different definitions of life, or on the flip side, death.
Yep. Oh, yeah. And death is a really interesting example of argument from definition.
Yeah.
So Ed Schappa writes about this in a book about argument from definition. What does it mean to be dead? And does it mean the cease of respiratory and heart functions? And that was the definition for a long time, which meant it was really difficult to get organ donations.
Yeah.
And when the definition shifted to ceasing of brain function, someone could be declared legally dead when all brain function ceases. Then it became possible for people to donate organs while they were still viable. And so what is death? Well, it seems straightforward, but actually the debate over that definition determined public policy.
Incredibly difficult, right? Like these things that we think are so material are really ripe with, impregnated with controversy.
What is life? What is death? What is a hurricane-related death? What is a COVID-related death? Yeah. What's pornography is another example of a controversy.
Yeah.
About definition.
But I know it when I see it, right? Isn't that the legal definition?
Well, no. The Supreme Court definition of obscenity is that it is sexual, it is appeals to prurient interest, and deals with bodily functions. So it's not just explicit sexually, it can also be like defecatory to mean obscenity. And the impact of obscenity is that it rends or hurts the moral fiber of society. Pornography, in McKinnon and Dworkin's ordinance, was the graphic sexually explicit subordination of women and children or other people used as women that included one of, I think it was 9 or 11 characteristics. And the impact of pornography was that it was a form of sex discrimination. Depending on how you define that stuff, sexually explicit, violent, right? You react to it differently. If it's obscenity, then anybody who looks at it, anybody who produces it, and anybody who is in it is criminally liable for hurting society. If you take the McKinnon and Dworkin definition, anybody who produces or uses it may be civilly liable for and be sued for sex discrimination, but those who are forced to be in it aren't viewed as immoral or obscene. They're also viewed as someone who has been injured by this act of sex discrimination. So arguments over definitions, I find fascinating. And like I say, Schappa's work on it is really helpful, as is Zarefsky's.
Oh yeah, definitions, very important. Very, very technical, but man,
yeah,
super important. Well, that's super helpful. What else do you think we should know?
So I got 3 things for you.
Okay.
One is argument, like any skill, is learned. And to learn it, you need to practice it. And you need to get comfortable in it. And so just like being a good public speaker, being a good writer, being a good videographer, being a good meme maker, it takes practice and comfort. So cool on you all for taking this class. You are learning a skill that's incredibly important. Second thing I'd want you all to remember is that argument, like all communication, is filtered through the perceptions of the audience. And the reason why that's important is that for some groups, their argument is not perceived as reason giving, it's perceived as anger. And I can talk about this for hours on end. The research is really compelling that when people of color, particularly Black men and women, argue, they are perceived as angry, not as engaging in reason giving. When Black men engage in argument, it's perceived as incipient violence. When Black women engage in argument, they're perceived as mentally imbalanced. When white women participate in argument, they're often perceived as angry and as irrational. When Latinx folk participate in argument, it's viewed as emotional expression that needs to be managed. And so the research is pretty compelling. If you've got 2 bodies, and one's a white cis man, and one is a Black woman, and they say the exact thing in the exact same way, they make the same claim with the same reasons, in the same evidence, with the same presentational form, the man will be perceived as rationally engaging in argument with maybe a little righteous indignation. The Black woman will be perceived as angry, irrational, and she just needs to settle down. Why do I go through this? You should learn argument. Argument is incredibly important. And the next time you find yourself reacting to someone who's engaging an argument because you react to them in an emotional key, right? In an emotional valence where you want them to settle down, check yourself, right? Step back and ask, am I responding because I'm being disagreed with and that's making me uncomfortable? Or is this person really angry? And if you stop for just a moment and do a self-check, you'll begin to realize that you think some people are angry when really they're just arguing. And there are some people who are angry and you treat it as argument because they've got a position of power or a position of authority. So argument goes through a filter of perception. And some groups are not afforded the same latitude in argument as other groups unless we all work to check some of our biases. The other thing that I'd leave you all with, and I think you got this already, is argument happens in a lot of different modalities. It happens verbally, but it also can happen visually, and bodies themselves can argue. Enactment is the rhetorical form where a person functions as proof of the claim they're making. So when you have Mary Fisher at the Republican National Convention, who was the wife of one of the biggest Republican fundraisers, was white, incredibly wealthy, married when she contracted HIV, mother of 2 kids, when she tells the convention, you are at risk. HIV and AIDS is not just a disease of gay men. It's not just a disease of IV drug users. It's not just a disease of poor folk, right? She's proof. So bodies can argue, visuals can argue, verbals can argue, sounds can. Now we're getting into some places that I think other people are better equipped to talk about. So the final thing to remember is you can look at the world through a frame of argument, and what it gets you thinking about is, what's the bottom line, right? What is a person's basic position? What are the reasons for it? And where might be the grounds for disagreement? And what do we do with that disagreement? So work on argument, work on hearing argument when it's being made and not treating it as mere emotion, and work on framing understandings of the world by looking for places of agreement and disagreement, of clash, of dialectic, of refutation, of rejoinder. Because once you figure out the place where everyone agrees, you don't need to argue about it anymore. You can move to the place of rejoinder and rebuttal where time really needs to get spent.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much for your time today.
You are most welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd love to hear what your students think. And if you got questions for me, you know where to find me.
Absolutely.